In this video, we dive into the most disturbing times people were bitten in half by sharks. From a man who dove into chum-filled waters to recover a fallen cooler, to a poor volunteer entering the sea to clear debris after a minor spill. But first we begin with a man who waved off a lifeguard's warning and waded back out, just to retrieve a drifting inflatable. It was January 14th, 2015, the summer heat bearing down on a crowded stretch of sand north of Durban, South Africa, where the Indian Ocean's deceptively calm surface concealed one of the coast's most efficient predators. Thelina Mokoena, 33, worked as an accounting clerk. She rarely took time off, known among her co-workers for volunteering for weekend shifts and staying late during busy periods. This Tuesday was different. After 6 consecutive weeks of overtime, she had finally agreed to take a personal day. She had brought her 9-year-old niece, Kira, promising the girl's mother a fun beach outing. They had arrived mid-morning, and Thelina had rented a bright yellow inflatable float from a vendor near the parking area. Her friend said that she wasn't a strong swimmer, preferring to stay in waist-deep water where she could touch bottom. The float likely gave her confidence to venture slightly farther out, bobbing peacefully as small waves passed beneath. Her niece played in the shallows nearby, building sand structures and collecting shells. When the lifeguard whistles blew sharply across the beach around 11:20 a.m., most swimmers complied immediately, wading toward shore with children in tow. Thelina had started back as well, pulling Kira by the hand. But as they reached knee depth, she noticed the yellow float drifting past the sandbar, carried by a lateral current. The rental had cost 80 rand, not a fortune, but enough that losing it likely felt wasteful. A lifeguard on the tower shouted through a megaphone for everyone to exit the water completely. Thelina waved acknowledgement, but told her niece to stay on the sand while she retrieved the float. The lifeguard could not physically stop everyone, so she was able to wade back out. Tiger sharks are among the ocean's most opportunistic predators, growing up to 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,400 pounds. Unlike great whites, which prefer cooler waters, tiger sharks thrive in tropical and subtropical zones, particularly along coastlines where murky water provides camouflage for ambush hunting. Their serrated teeth are uniquely adapted to saw through bone and turtle shells. Studies show tiger sharks are attracted to contrasting colors and erratic movements, both of which can trigger investigative bites. She waded back in, moving through waist-deep water with determined strokes. The baitfish activity had intensified, creating small eruptions of silver across the surface about 30 yards to her right. Several beachgoers who had gathered their belongings stopped to watch, some pointing at the unusual fish behavior. One man later told investigators he had considered yelling a warning, but assumed the lifeguards had the situation managed. Thelina reached the float in chest-deep water, roughly 60 feet from shore, and grabbed the slippery plastic handle. At that exact moment, the school of baitfish nearest to her exploded upward in a tight spray, their bodies glinting as they scattered in panic. She turned toward shore, pulling the float alongside her body. The water surged violently to her left without warning. A tiger shark, later estimated at approximately 11 feet based on bite radius, rose from below in a sudden upward rush, its mouth already open. The impact threw Thelina upward at an angle, her torso bending sharply backward as the shark's jaws clamped across her midsection just below the ribcage. The bright yellow float flipped free, spinning across the surface. Witnesses on shore saw her upper body jerk violently as the animal bit down with crushing force, its serrated teeth sawing through flesh. The shark twisted sharply to the right, a characteristic tearing motion, and the water around her turned white with foam and then deep red. Her upper body disappeared beneath the surface within seconds as the shark pulled downward, thrashing in short, powerful bursts. The attack was later estimated by witnesses to have lasted only seconds. The water continued to churn for several seconds more, blood spreading rapidly across the surface in an expanding cloud. The medical examination later confirmed catastrophic trauma with substantial tissue loss and multiple deep, jagged lacerations across the abdomen and chest, consistent with repeated bites. Then terribly, everything went still, except for the gentle rocking of the abandoned yellow float. A surfer positioned about 120 feet down the beach had watched the attack unfold. He paddled frantically toward shore, screaming for help before he even reached the sand. Lifeguards activated emergency sirens within seconds of his alert. 2 rescue jet skis, already staged on the beach, launched from the tower station, arriving at the attack site in roughly 4 minutes. They found only the blood slick and the float. One guard reported seeing a large dark shape moving deeper into murky water beyond the sandbar. They recovered no immediate remains. A dive team deployed 40 minutes later located the remains approximately 200 yards offshore in 18 feet of water. The medical examiner reported catastrophic trauma with substantial tissue loss, consistent with a large shark attack. Beach authorities closed roughly 2 miles of coastline for 48 hours, while shark nets were inspected and patrols increased. Local news outlets ran brief reports about the incident, but avoided graphic detail at the family's request. But even as the torn yellow float washed back onto Durban's shore as a reminder, a repairman organizing a fishing trip off Texas would soon leap into chum-streaked water after something he'd dropped, seconds before a bull shark surged upward from below. It was June 3rd, 2017, the afternoon sun beating down on the flat expanse of the Gulf of Mexico, several miles off the remote stretch of Padre Island National Seashore, when a white cooler slipped from the deck and splashed into the chum-streaked water. Mateo Rinza was a 41-year-old refrigeration repairman from Corpus Christi who had organized the fishing trip with two friends from his bowling league. He was known for being practical and resourceful, the kind of man who fixed his own truck and never hired out work he could do himself. The cooler that went overboard was his, a $200 Yeti he had saved for months to purchase, packed with the day's catch of red snapper and kingfish along with 40 pounds of ice. The Gulf waters around Padre Island are murky year-round, with visibility rarely exceeding 10 feet even on calm days. The warm currents and abundant baitfish make it prime feeding grounds for bull sharks, one of the most aggressive shark species in existence. Bull sharks can grow to 11 feet in length and weigh approximately 450 pounds, with a bite force exceeding 1,300 pounds per square inch. Unlike most sharks, they thrive in shallow, murky water, where their gray coloring renders them nearly invisible. The group had been chumming the water for 3 hours, tossing cut bait and fish parts overboard to attract game fish. The cooler had been sitting on the gunnel, inadequately secured, when a wave rocked the boat and sent it tumbling into the Gulf. It floated 15 feet from the stern, clearly visible and drifting slowly with the current. Mateo's friends immediately told him to wait, that they could hook it back with a gaff pole or net. One of them, a man named Dennis Cruz, specifically mentioned sharks. They had seen a large shadow pass under the boat 20 minutes earlier, but Mateo was already kicking off his deck shoes, insisting it would take 30 seconds. Mateo ignored the Coast Guard recommendation to wear a personal flotation device while entering chummed waters. The water was only chest deep where they were anchored, he reasoned, and the cooler was already moving away. He did not hesitate. He jumped in feet first, creating a splash that sent ripples across the calm surface. The water was warmer than expected, greenish-brown and opaque. Mateo began swimming with strong strokes toward the cooler, which had drifted another 10 feet. His friends watched from the boat, one holding the gaff pole uselessly, the other scanning the water with growing unease. Mateo reached the drifting cooler within seconds, his hand closing around the handle. He turned back toward the boat, treading water, preparing to swim one-handed while towing the cooler behind him. From the boat, Dennis saw it first, a wide shadow passing beneath Mateo's kicking legs, moving with purpose. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the words caught in his throat as the shadow accelerated upward. The bull shark surged from below with explosive force, its blunt snout ramming into Mateo before its jaws clamped around his midsection. The impact was visible from the boat. Mateo's entire body lurched upward, folding sideways across the shark's snout as teeth sank into his thigh and abdominal area, tearing through muscle and tissue. The bite was crushing, immediate, and catastrophic. The shark's jaws exerted over 1,300 pounds of pressure, puncturing skin, muscle, and into the abdominal cavity. Mateo's scream was sharp and wet, cut short as the animal held him briefly in its jaws, then began to move. The shark executed violent thrashing and twisting to tear chunks of flesh, pulling Mateo's upper legs and lower torso. The witnesses on the boat leaned over the gunwale, screaming his name, watching helplessly as the water erupted in thrashing chaos. Mateo's arms and portions of his legs appeared above the water sporadically, but most of the attack was obscured by churning water and blood. The cooler, still floating nearby, rocked in the waves created by the violence. One of the men on the boat threw a rope instinctively, a pointless gesture, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim. The rope landed 6 feet short and floated uselessly. After approximately 15 seconds of sustained thrashing, the surface went eerily still. The shark had released what remained of Mateo and descended into deeper water. All that was visible were expanding patches of red water, floating ice that had spilled from the cooler, and a few pieces of torn fabric from his shirt. No body surfaced. The men stared at the empty water, both shouting Mateo's name, but there was no response, no movement, except the gentle rocking of waves. Dennis grabbed the VHF radio with trembling hands and transmitted a mayday call on Channel 16. The Coast Guard responded immediately, dispatching a 45-foot response boat. They arrived on scene approximately 22 minutes after the distress call. Coast Guard personnel conducted a search pattern around the coordinates provided, scanning for any sign of Mateo. Approximately 35 minutes into the search, crew members located remains floating 400 yards southeast of the attack location. The body had been massively mangled with severe trauma to the abdomen and thighs, showing torn flesh and partial separation of the lower torso. The upper and lower halves had been separated either by multiple feeding passes or post-mortem scavenging. Mateo's funeral was held 4 days later in Corpus Christi, attended by over 100 people from his workplace, church, and bowling league. His two friends who witnessed the attack both quietly discontinued their annual fishing trips. Yet even as the tragedy off Padre Island tore a body in pieces, in Brazil, a dental assistant on her honeymoon had waded into the dusk surf, ignoring warnings about what the discarded fish waste attracted to those waters. It was March 11th, 2016, and the sun was beginning its descent over Ilha Grande, casting amber light across the bay where the Atlantic met the Brazilian coastline. By nightfall, the waters off Praia de Palmas would be stained with blood, and a young woman's honeymoon would end not in celebration, but in a tragedy. Liana Corso was a 29-year-old dental assistant from São Paulo, known among her colleagues for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to put anxious patients at ease. She had met her husband, Tiago, 3 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday party, and their courtship had been marked by weekend trips to beach towns along the coast. Friends said that Liana loved the ocean with an almost childlike enthusiasm, having grown up inland and only discovering swimming in her late teens. The honeymoon to Ilha Grande had been Tiago's idea, a quiet, relatively undeveloped island where they could escape the noise of the city. They had arrived 4 days earlier and spent their time hiking forest trails and exploring secluded beaches. Liana had told the hotel staff she wanted to swim every day, even joking that she would go in at night if the water was warm enough. She was a confident swimmer, though not particularly experienced in open water, according to Tiago, and she approached the ocean with more enthusiasm than caution. The bay curved gently around Praia de Palmas, its waters deceptively calm in the protected inlet. Tiger sharks are opportunistic predators, typically reaching lengths of 10 to 15 feet and weighing up to 1,400 pounds. Their teeth are adapted for slicing through flesh and bone. They hunt primarily during twilight hours when visibility is low, patrolling shallow waters where prey is most vulnerable. That morning, the hotel manager had mentioned to guests at breakfast that local fishing boats often cleaned their catch near the shore, dumping fish carcasses and blood into the water. He suggested, in measured terms, that swimming at dusk was not advisable due to increased shark activity. Liana had smiled politely, but later told Tiago she thought Brazilian locals were overly dramatic about wildlife dangers. She had swum in the ocean dozens of times without incident. No lifeguards were on duty, and there were no official shark warning signs posted at the beach. By late afternoon, the couple walked down to the beach. The water was warm and clear, small waves lapping gently at the sand. Tiago wanted to photograph the sunset and set up his camera on a tripod near the tree line. Liana waded in alone, her yellow bikini bright against the darkening water. Two kayakers were visible about 180 feet offshore, paddling parallel to the beach. Liana moved into waist-deep water, perhaps 40 feet from shore. She turned back toward Tiago and waved. Beneath her, the sandy bottom dropped away sharply into deeper water. The kayakers later reported seeing bait fish suddenly scatter near the surface, creating sudden splashes and shadows beneath the water, a natural warning sign experienced fishermen recognize. The tiger shark struck with a single, powerful bite. Its jaws clamped around Liana's pelvis and upper thighs. The bite caused partial pelvic severance with ragged tissue and trauma to the upper thighs, consistent with a 13 to 15-foot tiger shark. The animal did not sustain feeding in shallow water. It retreated after the bite. Blood erupted into the water in thick clouds, the surface churning from the shark's thrashing tail. Her arms flailed once, twice, then went slack. The animal submerged with part of her lower body still in its jaws, leaving torn tissue behind, before moving back into deeper water. Her body floated face down, partially buoyant from trapped air in her lungs. The water around her had turned dark red, spreading outward in an expanding radius. Tiago's screams brought hotel staff running to the beach. One of the kayakers had already begun paddling frantically toward shore, shouting for help. A hotel employee called the emergency services. The nearest patrol boat was stationed approximately 4 miles away and arrived 18 minutes after the initial call. By then, Liana had bled out completely. paramedics could only confirm death at the scene. The coroner's preliminary report noted severe traumatic injuries with partial lower limb amputation, extensive tissue loss to the pelvis and upper thighs, and massive hemorrhagic shock consistent with a single investigatory bite from a tiger shark. Local media coverage was sparse and carefully worded, describing the incident as a rare and unfortunate tragedy. The hotel quietly revised its safety protocols, adding warnings about sunset swimming and posting signs, in addition to requiring signed waivers for any guests entering the water after 4 p.m. Tiago returned to São Paulo with his wife's remains 5 days later. He declined all interview requests and deleted his social media accounts. As Liana's honeymoon turned to horror in the Brazilian shallows, an appliance delivery worker struggling with a stalled jet ski off Bondi Beach would discover that the ocean's apex predator doesn't wait for warnings. It was February 9th, 2014, and the waters off Bondi Beach shimmered under the afternoon sun as Kieran Doyle guided his rental jet ski beyond the designated swim zone. Kieran was a 37-year-old appliance delivery driver from Perth, known among colleagues for his easygoing nature and tendency to squeeze adventure into every free day. He had arrived in Sydney 3 days earlier for what he called a reset trip, a solo week away from the routine of loading refrigerators and navigating delivery schedules. His social media showed photos of coastal walks and beachside meals, but what he wanted most was to get out on the water. He had never operated a jet ski before that afternoon. At the rental kiosk near the south end of Bondi, Kieran paid for a 30-minute ride and signed the standard waiver without reading it fully. The attendant, a university student working a summer job, provided a brief verbal safety rundown. Stay within the buoys, avoid swimmers, and if the engine cuts out, remain on the craft and signal for help. The attendant noted that Kieran nodded, seemingly eager to get moving. He had no boating experience and no understanding of how quickly circumstances could shift beyond the surf line. The attendant did not insist he attach the kill cord, and Kieran never clipped it on. The outer zone of Bondi Beach drops off sharply where the sandbar ends, creating a nutrient-rich upwelling that attracts bait fish and, consequently, larger predators. Great white sharks are among the ocean's most efficient hunters, growing to commonly between 11 and 16 feet in length. Their 300 serrated teeth are designed to shear through flesh and bone, and their ampullae of Lorenzini detect very close low-frequency electric fields. Though in open water they are more often drawn by splashing, injured baitfish, or strong vibrations. They typically strike from below with explosive force, often breaching entirely out of the water when targeting seals. Approximately 15 minutes into his ride, Kieran's jet ski began sputtering roughly 400 yards from shore, just beyond where the rescue buoys marked the edge of safe swimming. He attempted to restart it 3 times, each effort resulting in a weak cough from the engine before it died completely. Beachgoers later reported seeing him wave once toward the shore, but without urgency. 2 lifeguards stationed in the elevated tower noted the stalled craft through binoculars and began preparing a rescue board, following standard protocol for disabled watercraft. They estimated a response time of 3 to 4 minutes. What Kieran failed to recognize, and what the lifeguards would later emphasize in their incident reports, was the dorsal fin that surfaced briefly about 50 feet behind his jet ski during his second restart attempt. Rather than waiting on the jet ski as instructed, Kieran slipped into the water, holding onto the side of the craft with his left hand, while attempting to manipulate something beneath the hull with his right, possibly the intake grate, which sometimes became clogged with seaweed. The 2 lifeguards, now paddling hard on their rescue boards approximately 150 yards out, saw the large dorsal fin resurface much closer to Kieran's position. Both began shouting warnings and waving their arms. Several witnesses on the beach heard the shouts and turned to look. Kieran turned his head toward the sound just as the water around him seemed to shift and darken. The great white rose from below with stunning speed, its momentum carrying both shark and victim upward against the hull of the jet ski, with enough force to tip the craft onto its side as Kieran's weight shifted in the water. The shark's jaws closed across Kieran's waist with devastating precision, its upper teeth sinking into his lower back, while the bottom row crushed through his abdomen. Witnesses described seeing a massive bite that engulfed his torso, while the lower half remained partially visible for a few seconds before being dragged under by the shark. The shark shook its head laterally once, a behavior used to tear off large chunks, then circled briefly before returning for another bite. The upper torso remained firmly in the jaws as the shark tore through muscle and bone. Rather than a clean separation, the lower half was gradually pulled under with water movement and the shark's own momentum. The water erupted in a dark red bloom that spread rapidly across the surface. The jet ski, now capsized, drifted slowly in a circle. One of Kieran's sandals floated free, bobbing in the expanding blood slick. The lifeguards, still 75 yards away, immediately radioed for backup and a rescue boat. They reached the area within 2 minutes of the attack, but there was nothing to rescue, only the overturned jet ski and the unmistakable evidence of catastrophic predation. A surf life-saving rescue boat arrived approximately 6 minutes after the initial emergency call, along with 2 police vessels. Divers located Kieran's remains roughly 30 feet below the surface, lodged against an outcropping of rock approximately 80 yards from the attack site. Additional remains were recovered the following morning, washed onto rocks at the southern end of Bronte Beach, just over a mile away. The coroner's report noted death by exsanguination and catastrophic trauma, with injuries consistent with a large predatory shark. Bite radius measurements suggested a shark between 14 and 16 feet in length. Bondi Beach remained closed for 4 days following the attack, during which aerial patrols spotted multiple great whites in the area. Kieran's family traveled from Perth to claim his remains, and a small funeral service was held at a chapel overlooking the Indian Ocean, far from the beach that had taken him. Kieran's blood spread across the surface near his stalled jet ski. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, a cleanup volunteer wading through waist-deep water would discover that good intentions offered no protection against the shark from the murky depths. It was September 22, 2018, and the murky waters of Manila Harbor held secrets beneath their oily surface. A minor fuel spill 2 days earlier had left a sheen of debris floating near the river mouth where the Pasig emptied into the bay. And now a dozen volunteers waded through the contaminated shallows, hauling plastic bottles and soaked cardboard toward waiting collection boats. None of them knew that the same polluted conditions that drew them there had also attracted one of the ocean's most adaptable predators, a bull shark that had followed the scent of organic waste and blood from fish processing plants upstream. Ronald Pabico was a 45-year-old warehouse loader from the Tondo district, a man whose calloused hands told the story of 20 years moving cargo along Manila's waterfront. His neighbors knew him as dependable but quiet, the kind of man who showed up early for work and never complained about double shifts during the busy season. He had joined the cleanup effort through a parish church, where his wife served as a lector. Ronald rarely participated in church activities, but the priest had made a special announcement about needing volunteers, and his wife said that something about the direct plea had moved him to raise his hand. That Saturday morning, Ronald had taken a jeepney to the harbor with 3 other parishioners, arriving at the staging area where organizers from a local environmental group distributed gloves and mesh bags. He signed the volunteer roster in careful block letters and listened to a brief safety talk that focused mainly on avoiding sharp objects, wearing gloves, and not drinking the water. The coordinator mentioned that the outer harbor was generally safe for wading, though the water quality was poor. Volunteers were given no warning about sharks, which are occasionally present in shallow harbor waters, especially after heavy runoff. The group had also not secured a formal permit from harbor authorities, and no rescue plan or first aid measures for marine predator encounters was discussed. The harbor's outer edges, where container ships waited for berth assignments, created a brackish mixing zone between river runoff and seawater. This transitional environment was plausible territory for bull sharks, which can tolerate both fresh and salt water. These predators grow up to about 11 feet long and 500 pounds, and have a very powerful bite. Estimates vary by study. Unlike most sharks that avoid murky water, bull sharks have evolved to hunt in near-zero visibility, using electroreception to detect the muscle contractions of prey from yards away. The volunteers worked in a loose line, moving parallel to a rusty cargo barge anchored about 60 feet from shore. The water reached their waists, the bottom soft with decades of accumulated silt. Ronald worked methodically, bending to grab floating trash and stuffing it into his mesh bag. The barge crew, 4 men taking a cigarette break on deck, watched the volunteers with mild interest. One of them later told investigators he had noticed something large moving beneath the surface but had assumed it was debris caught in the current. The spill itself had created conditions that reduced visibility to less than a foot. The splashing of volunteers mimicked the erratic movements of injured fish. Blood and organic waste from the river mouth had drawn the shark into the harbor days earlier, and it had remained, feeding on the abundant prey the polluted water concealed. Bull sharks may exhibit bold behavior in confined, shallow spaces where escape is limited, increasing the chance of opportunistic attacks. Ronald had moved slightly ahead of the other volunteers, reaching for a cluster of plastic bags tangled in floating wood. He pulled the bags free and turned back toward the collection boat. The cargo barge crew saw the water erupt before anyone heard the sound. The bull shark struck from directly below with devastating force, its blunt snout slamming into Ronald's upper thighs and lower torso before its jaws clamped shut. The shark performed a thrashing motion, which teeth-equipped sharks use to tear pieces from large prey. The water around the collection site quickly clouded with blood and debris. The other volunteers began screaming and thrashing toward the collection boat and shore ladders. One woman vomited into the water. A young man later told police he saw Ronald's legs severely damaged and drifting separately, while his torso was heavily injured but partially submerged. According to witnesses, everything happened in an instant. On the barge, a deckhand grabbed the radio and called harbor authorities, shouting that someone had been attacked in the water. A harbor patrol vessel, stationed 3/4 of a mile away at Pier 15, arrived 12 minutes after the call, consistent with a patrol that happened to be nearby. Recovery divers arrived within an hour and located Ronald's remains separated by current flow over several sections, consistent with severe trauma from a bull shark, but not the immediate waist-level dismemberment that is extremely uncommon. Tooth fragments recovered at the scene were consistent with a large bull shark, roughly 9 to 10 feet long. The cleanup operation was immediately suspended. Authorities issued a temporary swimming and wading ban for the outer harbor zone, though enforcement was minimal. Local media coverage was brief and understated, with officials emphasizing the rarity of such incidents. The environmental group that organized the cleanup quietly disbanded 3 months later. The church held a memorial mass, but Ronald's widow declined to speak publicly. The shark was never located. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.